everybody. Thank you for joining me. This is Dr. Annette Feravich. We are in the classroom, and this is the Bookless classroom. Remember that the Bookless classroom doesn't mean we don't use books. In fact, we use books all the time. And in fact, one of the things about this Bookless classroom that we also are doing is that we are examining books is what we're doing. And that's actually what took me a little while this morning. There's always a reason why. Then all of a sudden I look at the clock. I'm like, gotta get on. And that is that, as you know, I left here on Thursday and I was very excited to tell you that I got quite a few more of these Cornerstone of Freedom book, right? Let's get that off there because I'm here. So I went through and started looking at these and was actually prepared because I got a few books about colonial America, and I wanted to look at those, and I wanted to decide that I wanted to read a few more. Instead of just trotting along with the presidents, I really wanted to, because there were a lot of things like we didn't have a story about the French. And I know that the Statue of Liberty came from France. We also know that France was very nice to us in allowing us to purchase that Louisiana Purchase territory there, all of that west that we purchased for a very good price. And I know that they did that because they liked us and they were our friend, our ally. And I wanted to look at that a little bit more. So I looked at, did I not bring those books here? How could I have a stack of books? Oh, no, I did. So I was looking at this one. So as you know, I got, 5 new books of the Cornerstone of Freedom recently. So I got 17 new books total, but I think I got the last group of them on Wednesday. So I was looking at them and I talked to you a little bit about them on Thursday. And that is what made me want to go back and take a deeper dive into colonial America. One of the biggest reasons why was because I found that this idea that the United States is this great experiment, very, very intriguing. As if it was really, we were called it, in passing we were called the great experiment. However, I do believe that we really truly are an experiment, like a real life experiment. And it would have started with Christopher Columbus, and Christopher Columbus was sent over by the Catholic Church. So this makes sense to me historically that the Catholic Church might start an experiment and send Christopher Columbus out on a voyage where he was skilled, but it was interesting because he was skilled, but he was not formally educated. Same as George Washington, skilled, but not formally educated. And so it seems like they put these guys out there on a limb to get them to do sort of their dirty work a little bit. And if they survive and if it's successful, then they take the credit for it. It's no different than what I'm talking about in this Robbers Cave study, which actually was done with young boys, and at the first one that was done. And what Sharif did was he did a study earlier than this, and since it was successful and nobody found out about or discovered all of the wrongdoings that he was doing, then he decided to take credit for it. So that's what it seems like. And so I wanted to do a little bit of a deeper dive into what really happened. Are we really the great experiment? And that's what I wish that my viewers would do as well. I wish that my viewers would also, looking at drop frames for some reason, frames are dropping. I don't know why. I'm looking at my viewers also to be commenting and giving me some good information. I had somebody comment on manna, thinking manna was mushrooms, but it couldn't be mushrooms because manna came from heaven, not grown on the ground. And so these are the things I think that we need to know. that somebody my age assumes you know, because I assume that you have learned the same things I have. But I see clearly we are not learning the same things, and our educational system are two very different things. So, interesting, because I kind of grew up in the backwoods is what I did, sort of in the country is what I did. And really for education, it was a small school in Brunswick, Michigan. St. Michael's is where I got my education from. And we had 2 classes per room. So first and second was together, third and fourth was together. That's how small the school was. And I think that there were, I don't know, 600 students there or something like that. No, there couldn't have been. 200, something like that. And the entire school, right? So 30 kids per classroom, 1, 2, 3, 4 classrooms. Yeah, about 120 kids. That's what I think. I think there probably weren't even 120 kids. Maybe not even. That's the school I grew up. So backwoods, but I got a decent education. But it was very interesting because I've said this before. We never got history. We never got history. We barely ever got social studies. I got government in high school, right? But not at the Catholic school there. We learned a little bit of science, but not a lot. Mostly what we learned was religion is what we did. We learned a lot of religion and math. We did a lot of math and spelling and reading. So our basics, we really did get our basics in that backwoods school. So that was really good. And a really good insight into grammar as well. So really good teaching of grammar, which I don't even know how much grammar you get anymore. Put my coffee in a coffee cup. Cools down too fast. Okay, so the next story, you're like, we didn't finish the last story, Dr. Feravich. Yes. But I needed to prepare because we were halfway through, right? So I'm preparing and we were supposed to go on to the presidents. But as I got my new books, I started thinking we have not really covered some things that I would like to find out more about. Remember, I'm learning along with you. So don't be embarrassed about the classrooms that you are in or the age that you're in those classrooms. I found out that there are early bird classroom people that are in my early bird that are adults that are in that classroom. And why not? Why not learn that way? Easy peasy to learn that way with me. I think I'm a pretty easy teacher. My grades are pretty easy, right? Okay. So I wanted to read this book, right? So 500th anniversary commemorative edition. So that was interesting to me. And 500th anniversary, so 1492, 500 years, so 1992 commemorative edition here, right? So that's nice, I thought. But what I didn't think was nice was some of all the discrepancies that were in here. Whoever put this book together really was very careless. And remember what I was saying before about what makes a good book, right? Especially I loved the story of Valley Forge and the story of Jamestown. Those were, I loved all the stories that we read. So we read Lewis and Clark Expedition, The Trail of Tears, which I loved. But Valley Forge, story of Jamestown, and the Oregon. We didn't read the Oregon Trail. Yeah, that one was a little, let me see here. I just want to look at this for discrepancies really quick. So that's what I found were discrepancies. Yeah, Oregon Trail was kind of boring because a lot of this was written by the people who were traveling, which is interesting about their travels. But we've read a lot about travels and what we don't know about, you know, because a lot of this was written by the women, some of this. So they were really writing this not really as an observer trying to get all the facts down, but as a writer that somebody might want to read. So embellishing that's the word that I want to use, embellishing. And embellishing means a fancy way to kind of lie. That's what embellishing is. It's like when somebody says, I caught a fish and it was this big, when the fish was really only that big. He caught a fish, right? And it was of a certain size, but he embellished the size by saying that it was this big, right? That's kind of what I'm finding out in some of these stories, in a lot of stories. And that's actually a great word for me to talk about right now for what you want to be watching out for is embellishing. Are they telling you a story that seems too good to be true, right? And not really telling you about all of the hardships. It's one of the hardest things about reading stories about like Disney stories or believing Disney stories. The hardest thing about that is that you see, for comparison, you compare yourself to characters who aren't real, right? And so if you're comparing yourself to a character that isn't real, and that character is not limited to the physical world like we are, and they can do things that we can't do, at least not right now, right? Then that makes us feel very inadequate. It makes our lives feel like they aren't as special as the people in our Disney stories, right? That our lives aren't as special as the characters in our dreams or in our fantasies. And that's just not true. When you think about it, when you think about the struggles that Christopher Columbus really had, right? For example, he had to go on a mission where he didn't get his money that he was supposed to get. Why? Because he didn't bring back gold. He didn't find gold. So what did they end up bringing back? Well, tobacco, which is basically a drug, right? We have all these resources here in the United States, but the very first export, the very first thing that we took from our land to go and trade it was tobacco. That was the very first successful trade that we ever had, tobacco, which is basically a drug, like I said, right? It actually is nicotine is one of the top most addictive drugs. And now we've got a few more on board now that we've got these new fancy chemicals that they've been making in the lab, the opioids and things that they've been putting in our pharmaceuticals. So those are actually more addictive than the drugs we used to get 40 years ago that were illegal, right? But the legal drugs like tobacco with the nicotine in it, that nicotine is one of the most addictive drugs. And so we were basically, our first export here out of this country was tobacco. Where's the book here, Cornerstone, on tobacco? That's what we need. We need a book here on the very beginning of tobacco. Where's that? So I was looking here, and so remember, I was interested because I think that the United States is truly the great experiment. And I think that the experiment is being done with freedom. Do you really want freedom? Or do you want somebody to tell you a fantasy? Do you really want freedom, and do you really want to make your own choices? Or do you want somebody just to tell you a fantasy or a story, right? What do you want? And how do we know? I started this by how do we know the difference? We have to recognize this, because this is the battle. The battle is that for this age of a classroom, you need to know the battle is between freedom and democracy and communism. And that is a very, very real battle that we're having right now. And so what will communists do? How do you recognize communism right here in this country? Well, they're going to tell you what you want to hear. They're going to tell you what you want to hear, what you want to hear, but it's not going to be the truth. It's going to be what you want to hear. So when I was going back and I was looking to see what book I wanted to read after I followed up this book on presidential elections. What did I want to read after that? Because like I said, I wanted to go in and do a deeper dive into this colonial America and the way that we started. So I started reading some of the new books that I got. And so some of those new books were, and so that's why I got for you, and we read the Bill of Rights, right? That was such a good book. That was such a good book. I didn't look at the pictures, and I don't know why I didn't look at the pictures. And now I'm looking at this book, and I'm like, I remember the words, but I don't remember all of the pictures because I didn't go through all of the pictures. Here, the Magna Carta on the right, signed by King John of England in 1215, laid the basis for the concept of writing human rights into law. That's amazing. That's amazing. And so, and we know that our amendments, like we said, look at this library card. That's a library card, in case you don't know what that is. We used to go into the library in order for us to check out a book. See what they're doing to our libraries? They're shutting them down. So in order for us to check out a book, we used to take this library card, and we used to write our name on the library card. And then there would be a due date on this library card, and this would be filed with the librarian, and this would stay in the library. So this library card went with this book, and it knew that I checked out this book. And then I would have this book at home, right? And then there would be a due date stamp right there. So there would be a due date, and I would know, because it would be the very last date stamp there, when I had to return that book. And that's how we used to take books out of the library. So I would then return this on the due date, and the librarian would find the library card and then put the library card back in the book. But notice, not one single name, not one single stamp. And this looks like it was put here in 1993, right? Without a name or without a stamp. So not one person checked this book out. But you all got to hear it. You all got to hear me read this. So this was the book a few classes ago. I probably read it in day number 15, something like that. I might have read this. So take a look at this if you want to hear about the Bill of Rights. But what a wonderful book. What a wonderful book this was, putting all of this together. And remember Ernesto Miranda. So, and then I went and I saw it the next day, or maybe after we read this book, Miranda. And those are the wonderful things, but that I think happen when you do deeper dives, a little bit deeper dives. I think those are the wonderful things that you find. I don't know why I didn't go through these pictures. The Bill of Rights allows Americans to criticize the government publicly on any issue, including civil rights above, economic policies to the right, and the rights of the disabled. So, where are those rights now, though? Do we even talk about the rights for people who have disabilities, right? We talk about mental illness a lot, but what about the rights of, I see a lot of children, and I don't see them on a regular basis, but I see them and have throughout my lifetime seen a lot of children in inner city Detroit schools that are simply not getting any money for their education. And what do you think is going to happen to those children? Well, those children might vote, right? Those children may vote, and they may vote for things that make them feel better, like fantasies, instead of things that are reality, like freedom and making free choices. So I hope that you're paying attention to some of these things and go back on the lessons. I started this with, so I went and I got the book from Christopher Columbus, right? So this was the one that I wanted to go back to because I feel like that America really is a great experiment. And I thought maybe if I went back to this book, maybe this book would tell me something about the great experiment. But unfortunately, it's not. And unfortunately, I found a bunch of problems with this book, and then it made me really sad. So I read this book last night, and I had to stop reading it because it made me really sad that here, these Cornerstone of Freedom books, these books, they're changing just like they said that they were going to, right? They said that they were going to change our books so that our books read more like we were heroes. And this is a perfect example of a book that's been changed, that history has changed in order for Christopher Columbus to look like a hero. Now, in my eyes, Christopher Columbus already was a hero. But in order for all of America to look like a hero, it looks like some people had to change the real story. So some of the things that I'm looking at. So take a look at this. This is the 500th anniversary commemorative edition. So 500th anniversary of Christopher Columbus, 1492 to 1992. So that makes sense to me. At first it didn't make sense, but it does now. By Zachary Kent. So the story of Christopher Columbus by Zachary Kent. But then here, when I open it up and I take a look at this, it says R. Conrad Stine. So R. Conrad Stine is the author of these books that I've been reading, but it doesn't sound like his writing because this sounds like mumbo jumbo to me. And it sounds exactly like mumbo jumbo. Let me show you something. And that's what we're looking at. We're looking at, does the information make sense? There are a lot of things that sometimes people say that we don't understand, right? There are a lot of things that people say that we don't understand. And a lot of times we think it's our fault that we just aren't smart enough to understand what they're saying, right? And that might be true. That might be true if you, for example, don't know how to read, for example, and somebody's saying read the next paragraph, it's going to sound like mumbo jumbo, isn't it? Well, there's a lot of people who aren't being trained for their jobs like they're supposed to be. And so what they're saying sounds important, like you should know what they're talking about, but in the end, it's a lot of mumbo jumbo is what it is. So that's what I found out about this book. Unfortunately, it's a lot of mumbo jumbo. And this is happening and this is occurring. Why? Because people said, like the former President Trump said, let's rewrite history. And now what we have is books that we think are real, and they are giving us a lot of mumbo jumbo. So we have to look for those things, and we have to be investigators to see if our books are good books. So this says by Zachary Kent, which it likely is by Zachary Kent, because the books that I've read by Conrad Stine, who actually has an ethnic name that some people probably simply do not like, right? But it says by Conrad Stine, so who is it by? Well, given all of this mumbo jumbo over here that they're talking about, I would guess it's written by Zachary Kent and not by Conrad Stine, because I like Conrad Stine's work. So let me give you an example right here. I'm going to show you that picture up close there so that you can see what that looks like. And I'm looking at the map here. All right. So there, hopefully you could see the picture of that map there. And this is what it says. As this old map shows, before 1492, Europeans had no idea that the huge landmass of America lay between Europe and Asia. Okay, well, I get it. We didn't know in 1492 that there was a great landmass of America. We didn't know that because Columbus hadn't discovered it yet. And for the Europeans, right? The Indians were there, but we didn't know it. Well, how does that show that on the picture? Europeans had no idea that the huge landmass of America lay between Europe and Asia. There's no big landmass there that they're showing. If they're showing this, I don't even know what this is. This says India over here. This says Africa over here. This says Spain over here. I don't even know what they're showing you over here. This is mumbo jumbo. That's what it is. What they're trying, I've said this before, where students don't look at pictures anymore. in pictures, they really do say 1,000 words. If I take a look at this picture, I'm seeing all these lands. This doesn't look anything like I've ever seen, all broken up. All I see, these are a bunch of islands. You're not showing me any land mass here. So I could look at this picture and try and understand it. And I see that these words don't match the picture. The other thing is the quotes. So quotes, we really want our quotes to say something, to tell us, to give us some detail that's important detail. We don't just throw a quote in there for the purpose of putting a quote in there and then making it look like it's authority, right? Like a person's authority, like they know what they're talking about, like they must have gotten a quote. These are nonsense quotes. At a very tender age, I entered upon the sea sailing. It's not even just who talks like that. It's like, what does that even mean? Where'd you get that from? When did he write that? At a very tender age, I entered upon the sea sailing. And that doesn't help me. I'm just looking at this. I'm sorry. But I just found this to be just nonsense. The Lisbon harbor as it looked during Columbus's time. Really? Because Columbus first landed there. How could the harbor look like this? There were only Indians there, and they didn't have ships. That's a lie. That's a lie. So I had to now examine this, and somebody did put this out here. For what reason? What reason? Here on the back. Bright moonlight shone over the water during the early morning hours of October 12, 1492. Christopher Columbus and his crew spent 36 days sailing the unknown regions of what now is called the Atlantic Ocean. What is now called the Atlantic Ocean, it's been called the Atlantic Ocean. What do you mean now called? As if we just named it the Atlantic Ocean. So this book is filled with a bunch of nonsense, and I don't even know who to write about this stuff. Probably the publisher is what I'm going to do. You know, one of the things that I was reading is for our philosophical classroom is I'm reading a Senate hearing about this Senate hearing, and the Senate hearing is about prisoners of war. Prisoners of war. Those are POWs. Prisoners of war. P. Prisoners of O. War. W. If you didn't know what POW was, that's a prisoner of war. And I was reading about the prisoners of war in Korea for the Korean War. And what they were saying, and this they were talking also about World War II, but this was after World War II. So we want to know our history a little bit. We'll be getting into that after we figure out the truth for this colonial America, which is what we have to figure out. But what the prisoners of war said, because they were talking to Congress, so this was their actual words. So what the prisoners, these were American prisoners in Korea. So they were experiencing the torture, Chinese torture, basically, is what they were, our prisoner of war. Communist torture, to be more specific. It was communist torture that our American prisoners were experiencing over there in different types of, but they were talking about in Korea specifically. And what the prisoner of war said was that they didn't know what to expect from the enemy. Because here in America, they knew the rules, right? You know the rules. And we treated our prisoners of war like human beings. So our prisoners that we had hardly any prisoners die. There, they had something like, I can't remember if it was 2/3 that died, probably 2/3 that died of the prisoners, American prisoners there in Korea, under communism. So what did communists do to our American prisoners? What communists did to our American prisoners was they did psychological torture to them. That's what they did. It wasn't physical torture. It was psychological torture is what they did. And you could read more about it, but the problem, what they said was that you didn't know what to expect because there were no rules. They had no rules. They had no rules. If this becomes an America that doesn't have a democracy, then government has no rules. And what they will end up doing is they will write their own history any way that they want to. Why? Because they have no rules. So what we're looking out for is we need rules that make sense. We need rules that are true. We need rules about who can write a book or who can put something on the internet and have it be true. We need rules, because if we don't have rules, just like our prisoners of war, we won't know what to expect. Why? Because our enemy, they don't follow any rules, so they might do anything. They could do anything to you. And here in America, the great experiment, we don't allow for that. We don't allow for people to be treated any which way. We have rules for the way that everybody should be treated. Black, white, rich, poor, Christian, Muslim, Jewish person. Here in this America, everyone had an opportunity to live their dream in this America. Please don't forget that. The prisoners of war said that they were afraid, although they didn't show it. If you look at the real stories, they were real heroes, amazing heroes that were trained to be heroes by this very government. By this very government, they were trained to be heroes. That's amazing. That's amazing. Because communists, they were not trained to be heroes. They were trained to give up information. They were trained to turn over their soldier, to turn over their neighbor. That's how they were trained. What kind of world do you want to live in? You have to stand up for democracy, but you have to know what democracy is. You have to know what it is. It is for everybody. Democracy is for everybody, not for only the few and not for only the rich. It has to be, because otherwise you will have no idea how that person is going to treat you. Amazing stuff. Okay. Amazing stuff. Let's continue. So now we are talking about the story of presidential elections, if you recall. So I'm trying to get to really understanding a little bit more about our electoral college. If you remember, George Washington was nobody ran against George Washington, right? So the question might be, well, was that really a democracy? Well, George Washington was elected by delegates who were representatives chosen by that state, right? So, which made sense. As we developed a government, it started from no government. It started from England governing us, right? And then we basically had to govern ourselves when we declared independence, the Declaration of Independence. I can't remember if I think, do I have that? That's actually what we need to be reading next, is the Declaration of Independence. And I didn't show you, but I showed the last class. We are really going to be looking at, and the reason why I didn't show you, but the last class was because they were just looking at the books that we were reading and showing them. So there's all the books that I got from Cornerstone of Freedom, right? So those are the books, and I'm going through them. Where is that Declaration of Independence? Do I not have a Cornerstone of Freedom that's a Declaration of Independence? I find that hard to believe. But there are other stories here that I'm going to be going through. I do. That's the next one. That's the next one we're going to look at. But I have to look at it to make sure that it's a good book. So like I said, we're going to be, all right, so this is by Norman Richards. This one I believe I got earlier, not later. I think this was part of the yard sale, but maybe not. Maybe not. So, and I also have a book. So I'm going to be deciding the rest of the books that I'm going to be reading, and I have to look closer at this. But we're going to do a little bit more of a deep dive into Columbus. The other books that I wanted to look at was, I was looking at the Statue of Liberty. I wanted to look at the story of the Pilgrims, because so much of our freedom has to do with religion, the freedom of religion as well. So I don't feel like we know enough about that sort of movement. There are a lot of movements here in the settling of America that I don't feel that we know enough about. So I have more stories here about El Indios, Los Indios. It should be El Indios. It would be Los Indios. I have a few other stories that I'm going to be taking a look at. So the story of Little Bighorn is one of them. Here is a story of, just to kind of be looking forward to some of these things. Wounded Knee, the story of Wounded Knee, the story of the battle for Iwo Jima. How about that? I don't know anything. And do you know anything about D-Day? I know something about it, but embarrassingly to say, not enough. So here we've got the story of D-Day, right? So this is a little bit later on, but I wanted to go through these stories to find out. And there's a story of the women's movement. There's a story of the assassination of John F. Kennedy. The story of the death of Lincoln. So we'll get to that one when we're doing our presidents. But like I said, what am I doing? I'm backing up a little bit is what I'm doing, because I don't think that we have got the full real story of colonial America. Again, like I said, I know that we had a great relationship with France. And so I read a little bit more about the Statue of Liberty. And that actually was going to be the next one that I read. I want to read to you about the Statue of Liberty, because that was an amazing, I did look at this book, so that's going to be the next one that we read. And I figured, that represents, so what with all the things that we don't know? Here is the story of Old Glory. Do you know what Old Glory is? I bet you don't. It's our flag. That's our flag. So don't we want to know the story of our flag? Yes, of course we do. So I'm going to go back and even like the United Nations. We talked about the United Nations a little bit. Here's the assassination of John F. Kennedy, the story of the Alamo. So here, these are stories about American Indians. I know that I know, but I don't know the rest of it, right? I got two stories. I think I got that on accident. So I have two of these. And in fact, I'm going to find ways that I'm going to be giving extra books away that I have. So I'm going to give them, I'm not giving anyone the Christopher Columbus book, unless you write in the comments that you want the Christopher Columbus book to tell me that you want that Christopher Columbus book to study, to see what was wrong with that book and find out all the things. You can put that in the comments and I'll send you that book. I will find out a way to get a hold of me through email. Email me and I will get you that book, all right? And you can take a look at it if you want to. Freedom Riders, Peace Corps, Montgomery Bus Boycott. I did purposefully get two of these because I wanted to compare two different versions of this. This is a library edition, which was more expensive than this one was. So I wanted to see if I got two different editions, if they were still the same. Look at that. There's library edition. There's the library card. Last time it was checked out, there's the due date, right? They crossed all the other ones out. It was due February 5th, 2016. So that's nice. Somebody took that out more recently. And this one was taken out quite a bit from the library. This was not a library book, so I'm going to go ahead and compare these. But look at this. This is older. You could see that this book is older. It's got yellowing pages to it, right? And this has got those original kinds of hand drawing pictures in it as well, not the kind of photographs that these have in it. So these are all the kinds of things you want to pay attention to. I don't know which is better, the photograph one. If they're real photographs, it would probably be. But those drawings are pretty good too, aren't they? And those drawings, they probably use those drawings so they didn't have to pay somebody for the photos. So they were doing it at less expense is what they were doing. That's okay too, right? That's okay. Sometimes if you put more money into it, you get more, you know, what we might call BS, crap, right? Okay, if somebody wants this Christopher Columbus book, you can email me or you can put a comment down there and I will send this to you. But your purpose is you have to tell me that you want to examine this for flaws is what you want to do. And I'll send that. There are other books I've seen that I just thought of that I would like to send you, but I do need to get a bigger audience here. So folks, come on in and stick around and stick around. It doesn't really matter to me if you stick around or not, right? I mean, it's nice if you stick around, but if you're nervous, I'm not going to call on you. So don't worry about that. This was our Bill of Rights. That was such a good book. Okay. So, and then here are some other ones. Again, the White House, the Story of Old Glory. We're going to read that one because I'm going to read it. How about the story of the Capitol building, right? Where all of those insurrectionists were climbing all over our Capitol building. How about that story? And then the San Francisco earthquake. I want to read the story. So I started to say that there are a few stories that I feel that haven't been told. And one of the stories was the story of the statue of our friendship with France. I don't understand our friendship with France. They were very kind to sell that Louisiana Purchase to us. Even though they were going to lose the war, they were our great ally. And it seems like France has been, and they gave us the gift of the Statue of Liberty. That came from France. So I feel like we don't know enough about French in our friendship with France. I think it was a really good friendship is what I think it was. I also feel like we don't know enough about our early religious battles because lots of people came here for religious freedom. There was the Pilgrims, but there were also the Puritans. I'm very interested in the Puritans. I want to take a look at this book so we could find out, do a little bit more of a deep dive into the settling of the New World for religious freedom purposes. I haven't looked at this one because this one came in my newest collection. So it came here last Wednesday and I was reading the Christopher Columbus one that was like, I was like, what's wrong with this book? And I already see a quote here. He was a special instrument. I don't know. We'll see if the quotes are right. But I also want to see if they talk about the Puritans because that we don't know enough about that. I don't feel to understand the full religious freedom that people were looking for. There were the Pilgrims, but there were the Puritans, where I believe we also had the Quakers were an outcome of that as well. So there's some interesting religious freedoms that people wanted that we have not explored here at all. The Mayflower Compact, I said I thought about reading this and then I read something else to you instead of I think I read Valley Forge is what I read to you instead of the Mayflower Compact. But this is our very first charter, our very first document that is leading to our freedoms and to being a free land, right? And governing ourselves as a free group of states. So I feel like I want to read this one. Here we have 1607 is when we're talking about. But here I don't feel like we also gave the Dutch enough time to understand what did the Dutch do for early settlement. We know that they came into north, into Canada more. That would also be the French. See, I don't know. Maybe the Dutch were over there out west. I don't know. So I know that we have Dutch who have settled here, that they have different ideas, that their culture didn't stay as long as the English culture, but that's all I know about it. So I want to look at this one as well. And then I think, actually, I don't think we're going to do the Statue of Liberty next. I think we need to do the Declaration of Independence next. And then we'll do the Statue of Liberty. So there's a couple different books that we're going to be looking at. And now let's get back to our story of the presidential elections, right? So here we are taking a look at, again, where George Washington, who was a Federalist, right? A Federalist, he believed in the power being in the federal government. So as a Federalist, he believed in the powers of a federal government. And this seemed to limit some of the individual states' rights. So here has been the argument that we've been arguing still to this day, right? How much, and if we had a federal government with integrity that was honest, I have to say a strong federal government with a democracy where we could vote is really what we're looking for. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what that means as far as voting goes and who like represents democracies. We're going to talk more about that. I'm going to, let's see here. I'm going to go back one page here. All right. So here we've got an 1860 Republican campaign poster for Abraham Lincoln on the left and vice presidential candidate Hannibal Hamlin on the right. It's got to be a replica. I don't know. How interesting. So there's a poster. Could that possibly be? Somebody needs to look that up if that poster is real. Somebody please look that up for me. All right, so I'm going back here. So we have the Republican, so we have the United States along with the Democratic Party. So we have the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, but don't be fooled by their names. You have to remember what they are representing. And for the most part, the Democratic Party was representing Federalists, Republican Party was representing states' rights, from what if I have that right. If I don't have that right, let me know. Abraham Lincoln eventually won the 1860 election, even though he was not listed on the ballot in southern states. So that's interesting as well. Was there election fraud all the way back to Abraham Lincoln? Likely so. The South was so opposed to Lincoln that his election led to a split in the nation. Southern states left the Union and formed their own nation called the Confederate States of America. By 1861, the Civil War had begun between the North, the Union, and the South, the Confederacy. And we're gonna talk more about that Civil War, right? But right now we really didn't need to know how we got to vote. That's what we needed to know, how we got to vote. As the election of 1864 approached, the war was going badly for the North. Many Northerners were blaming Lincoln for the long and costly war and had claimed thousands of lives. Even Lincoln doubted he could beat his Democratic opponent, General George B. McClellan. That name I just came across as well. I came across that name. He was one of the representatives in the hearings that I was talking about. So those communist hearings with McCarthy, this is getting for a little bit, somebody who knows a little bit more about history. So McCarthy was doing like a witch hunt for communists. And this hearing that I'm reading about preceded this witch hunt. So this was McCarthy at this hearing before he started witch hunting communists. And you know who else was there? McClellan. So I'm going to find out more about that. He was Lincoln's opponent, George B. McClellan. But just weeks before the election, the North began scoring important military victories. This helped Lincoln. He also gained popularity by choosing a Democrat, Andrew Johnson, as his running mate. Lincoln wound up defeating McClellan in 1864 by a solid margin. At least 540,000 Americans lost their lives in the Civil War. When it was over, the North had won, and the Southern slaves were eventually freed. On April 14, 1865, just 5 days after the South's surrender, President Lincoln was shot in the head by an assassin. So this was only 5 days after the South surrendered, right? So we'll learn more about the Civil War, but that seems, I mean, obviously he was murdered, right? He was murdered. It's interesting here that it doesn't say in this book, and I saw another book too about that where it doesn't say who his murderer was, which was John Wilkes Booth. I don't know why they are not saying his name. That's so interesting to me. He was murdered by John Wilkes Booth. Historically, that's what we know. Maybe that's not true, but that's what we were told historically. But Lincoln's death did not halt the cause of African American rights. In 1870, the 15th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified. This amendment gave African American men the right to vote in elections. Women still couldn't vote, but African American men now could vote. The assassination of President Lincoln on April 14th, 1865. John Wilkes Booth crept up behind Abraham Lincoln at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., and then shot Lincoln in the head. Interesting. In 1876 presidential race between Republican Rutherford B. Hayes and Democrat Samuel Tilden was one of the most controversial in U.S. history. The outcome of this close race depended on the results in 3 key southern states, but the Democrats and Republicans each accused the other of cheating in those states, just like elections today. In the end, Congress assigned a special commission to count the votes and decide who would be the next president. The commission, controlled the Republicans, determined that Hayes had won. The commission, controlled by Republicans, determined that Hayes had won. To this day, many historians disagree with the commission's findings. They say that Tilden was the actual winner. Hayes and the Republicans were right about one thing. They said that Southern whites used intimidation to keep African American voters from casting their ballots. This was an undeniable fact. In some cases, the ballots cast by blacks were actually changed by white officials. Some polling places were secretly moved so that black voters could not find them, and houses of many blacks were burned to frighten them from voting. And conditions got much worse for African Americans in the South. By the 1890s, Southern states required all voters to pay special voting taxes or to pass reading tests. White politicians knew that many poor and uneducated blacks could not meet these requirements. And this is what we're seeing here today with what is going on with taking away individuals' rights. And we are talking about all different kinds of things like changing our districts where we vote. So we have districts where we vote. If I change the districts, I'll get more black people there or more white people there, right? And then if I can do that, I might be able to change who is going to be president of the United States. By what? By changing the districts to have more white people in that district and some black people, right? If I get the black people not to vote and I get enough white people to vote, they're going to vote for what? Rules that help the white people. So this has been going on for a long time. Look at this. So we're talking about 1890s is when we're talking about. So when people say, well, slavery was 300 years ago, well, that doesn't sound like 300 years ago, right? That sounds like 100 years ago, 150 years ago, right? That we are making these laws. And we'll see all the way into the 1950s that there were laws against African Americans. And that's the reason why we needed more amendments, is because for what? For human rights. So the federal government didn't violate human rights, right? What did we say back there about the very first human rights that were signed by King John, right? In the early 1900s, 2 reforms made United States presidential elections significantly more democratic. First, some states began holding primary elections. Primaries give citizens direct influence on who will be their party's presidential candidate. In the decades to come, primaries became a key part of the election process. The other important reform was the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, which was ratified in 1920. This amendment gave women the right to vote. For the first time in U.S. history, a true majority of all adult citizens possessed voting rights. That was 1920. So when people say stop complaining about slavery, well, really, if you didn't have a voice, it didn't matter anyway, right? If you didn't have a voice, and women didn't have a voice until 1920. Okay. This amendment gave women... Okay. Technology also began changing presidential elections. In 1920, commercial radio stations began broadcasting in the United States. Candidates quickly discovered that radio was a way of reaching millions of voters at a time. Of course, of course. I didn't think I finished reading this. White politicians knew that many poor and uneducated blacks could not meet these requirements. Therefore, they could not vote. Voting rights would not improve for African Americans in the South until the 1960s. And so once again, people are saying, stop talking about slavery. You've had rights. You haven't been a slave since, Emancipation Proclamation from Lincoln, right? Stop talking about slavery. Well, improvements for voting rights for African Americans didn't happen until the 1960s. Okay. Until this time, most American voters never saw or heard presidential candidates speak. People learned about candidates' ideas and beliefs by reading newspapers or flyers. But with the dawn of the radio era, voters could hear candidates for the first time, which is pretty good because if you read a flyer, do you think that those flyers were all true about what they wanted to say? Probably not, right? Probably not. Now voters were swayed not only by the candidates' political beliefs, but also by their ability to give a good speech, which is true. Calvin Coolidge won the 1924 presidential election, and he attributed some of his success to a simple fact. He said, "I have a good radio voice." And in 1928, many radio listeners were irritated by Democrat Alfred E. Smith's heavy New York accent. Republican Herbert Hoover won the election. So here we have a picture of Calvin Coolidge. Here, the early 1900s photograph captures the presidential candidate Theodore Roosevelt on a whistle-stop tour. Before airplane travel, some candidates would crisscross the nation by train, stopping in every town and city along the way. They would speak to local citizens from the rear car of the train. Look at that. That's interesting. I saw pictures like that. I didn't realize that. That actually would make that person look very presidential, if you asked me, speaking from the rear car of a train. I think so. Women celebrate the passage of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution in 1920. The amendment gave women the right to vote. On the balcony is women's voting rights activist Alice Paul. Wow, not very many people who are coming out there to hear her speak, though, right? That's kind of interesting. And what was the amendment that women got the right to vote? The 19th Amendment. We can remember that by Juneteenth, right? Juneteenth is something we're celebrating, which I think is for all freedoms. So that was June 19th. So what was the amendment for women to vote? The 19th Amendment. How about that? I like that. Now I care really a lot more about Juneteenth. Let's see here. Where are we on time? We're supposed to be done. Holy smokes. What time am I getting back on again? 11. I need to look at what time I'm supposed to be getting back on here because I always forget. Uh-oh. I was supposed to be back on in 6 minutes with our critical thinking classroom. Okay, so, didn't get this story done for you, but I have to go because we have gone really quite long. So I'm supposed to be back here in 6 minutes. I'm probably going to be a little late, right? But maybe not. We'll see. So our critical thinking classroom here in 6 minutes at 10:30. This is Dr. Annette Feravich, who talked a very long time about picking out our special books. But we're going to finish this book, our presidential elections, tomorrow. And we will pick up with the Declaration of Independence as long as I find that this is actually a good read. All right, Dr. Annette Feravich, this is the classroom. I am the teacher. More specifically, this is the Bookless classroom, and I am Dr. Annette Feravich.